listener production.
Hello, Sasha Barbagat with you. Welcome to The Briefing. You might think the days of witch trials are long behind us. While they were a tragic and shameful chapter of human history, we have evolved and know more now than we did 500 years ago. But did you know there are people right now being hunted, persecuted and killed over fears they're witches?
We did a study looking just at reports on the internet and found there were reports across 60 different countries. So it's certainly a phenomenon that is widespread, and it doesn't seem to be one that is going away either.
We'll talk about that in the second half of this episode. First though, let's get into today's biggest news stories with Bension Siebert. It's Tuesday, the 7th of May.
Good morning, Sasha. For the first time since November, Hamas has accepted a ceasefire deal to pause the fighting in Gaza. But it might not go through, though, with an Israeli official saying no ceasefire had been agreed. The unnamed official also told Reuters news agency the deal includes far-reaching conclusions that Israel does not accept, calling it a ruse intended to make Israel look like the side refusing a deal. All very confusing. In a White House briefing, National Security spokesperson John Kirby confirmed the US is working through negotiations with Israel, but he couldn't shed much more light either.
We are at a critical stage right now. We got a response from Hamas. Now, Director Burns is working through that, trying to assess it, working with the Israelis. I mean, my goodness, folks, I don't know that it gets any more sensitive than right now. And the worst thing that we can do is start speculating about what's in it.
Yeah, and despite the lack of clarity, the news has prompted celebrations in the streets of Gaza. But while there's been this apparent acceptance by Hamas of a ceasefire, Israel has ordered around 100,000 people to evacuate the southernmost city of Rafah ahead of its long-threatened ground invasion. Bension, also happening today, there'll be a vote at the United Nations as to whether to admit Palestine as a full member of the UN. Australia's Penny Wong, our foreign minister, will be voting. And the reason that there will be eyes on this is because a number of countries that have Israel as an ally are expected to vote on whether to accept Palestine as a member of the UN. So there will be eyes on that vote today.
The parents of Australian brothers Jake and Callum Robinson have formally identified their sons' bodies after the pair were murdered in Mexico. They'd been travelling in the state of Baja with an American friend when they went missing late last month. Later, 3 bodies were found down a well. Local authorities have since charged 3 people with forced kidnapping. They're also expected to be accused of murder. It's believed the killed trio had been victims of an attempted theft and were shot execution style when they resisted. There are also questions about whether there was cartel involvement. Callum's girlfriend has posted a tribute for him, saying her heart is shattered into a million pieces. Very sad stuff.
Yeah, this is such an awful story. And honestly, the footage of the parents coming out of the morgue in Mexico is so distressing because, you know, you send your kids off for an amazing adventure and this horrific thing happens to them. Your heart just goes out to them. Local surfers did hold a paddle out vigil at San Miguel Beach, and there's a lot of anger and, I suppose, hurt among the locals because one was interviewed and they said, you know, we told them to go to this place. We said it was safe and that they should visit. So they feel guilt, which is obviously misplaced. But, you know, you can understand just how devastated even the local community is at what's happened here. And Baja is one of Mexico's most violent states, but where the brothers were in Ensenada, that area is considered safer. But obviously risks exist, especially in Mexico, all the time, no matter where you are. Donald Trump has been scolded by Justice Juan Merchan, who's overseeing his criminal trial after the former president violated a gag order for the 10th time. Justice Merchan said he would consider sending Trump to jail for any further violations. Now, he has already fined Trump 9 times, $1,000 each time, 1,500 Australian. And this was because Trump had violated that gag order 9 times already. Now he's done it for a 10th time. And the judge said this seemed to not deter him, even though he was getting all these fines. This gag order prohibits Trump from making public comments about the jurors in this case, the witnesses and families of the judge and prosecutors. This criminal trial is over the falsifying of business records to cover up a payment, a hush money payment to porn star Stormy Daniels in the lead up to the 2016 election. Daniels claims to have had a sexual encounter with Trump in 2006. The interesting thing, Bension, that the judge talked about when making this threat of jail again, this is the second time he's done it, by the way, was that, we have to take into account just how difficult it would be to lock up an ex-president who has a lifetime Secret Service detail. So those Secret Service officers would then have to be in jail with Trump too.
Yeah, and prosecutors have previously said that Trump is actually angling to be jailed for a gag order violation because that would help make his case that this whole thing is a witch hunt. We've been talking about witch hunts. We'll talk about it more later in the episode. But he's obviously trying to make this very legal process into a very political process as he continues to try and become the next president of the United States. And also in the US, it's Met Gala Monday. It's an extremely bougie charity event and fundraiser for the Metropolitan Museum of Art's Costume Institute, or the Met, in New York City, and is one of the most prestigious fashion events of the year. The event will kick off at 6 p.m. with about 450 attendees. Tickets cost around the equivalent of 120,000 Australian dollars for an individual. A 10-seat table starts at $700,000.
Bougie is right, Bension. The Met Gala always has a theme, and that's what people love to watch, all the celebs arriving at the event to see how on theme their costume is. This year's exhibition, which is what this celebrates the opening of the annual exhibition, is called Sleeping Beauties Reawakening Fashion, whatever that means. The official dress code is the Garden of Time, so maybe some leaf detail. I don't know, I'm not a fashion expert. Some flowers. I don't know. Garden
I want to see
stuff.
who comes as a monstera.
Aussie Chris Hemsworth will be one of the 2024 Met Gala hosts, along with Zendaya, Jennifer Lopez, and Bad Bunny. The other thing I really want to see, Bension, is whether Kim Kardashian will be there, because the editor of Vogue decides who goes to this event, and that's Anna Wintour, and we know she's petty. And last year we saw Kim damage that iconic Marilyn Monroe dress. So I want to know whether Anna Wintour is going to bar Kim from going to this event. It's silly, it's bougie, as you said, but honestly, with everything that goes on in the world, sometimes it's nice to just have a break and to look at some pretty clothes. Thank you so much for being here for the headlines, Bension. Next up, it is our deep dive looking at witch trials that are still happening across the globe in 2024. During the early modern period, I'm talking from around 1400 to the 1770s, parts of Europe and North America were swept up in witch hysteria. Thousands of men and women were persecuted by their communities who believed they had been practicing witchcraft. As many as 60,000 people were executed. It was a shameful and dark chapter in our history, and governments around the world have since made formal apologies and have even exonerated victims. Memorials too have been erected in prominent witch hunting locations, including at the infamous Salem in Massachusetts. It might seem like we've moved on from those days, but tragically, people are still being persecuted for witchcraft in places like sub-Saharan Africa, India and Papua New Guinea. One 2020 UN report claims at least 20,000 so-called witches were killed across 60 countries between 2009 and 2019. Who is at risk of this? Why are they being targeted? And why are we only now sitting up and taking notice? Today I'm speaking with Professor Miranda Forsyth from the School of Regulation and Global Governance at ANU to find out. Professor, thanks for joining us on the briefing today. Why are we still seeing people being hunted and hurt and even killed over something like witchcraft?
It's a complex phenomenon, and so there are lots of reasons for it. But generally, when things are uncertain, when bad events happen, when there's unexplained sicknesses and deaths, then in many countries people turn to ask who has caused this. And where there is a narrative that sorcerers and witches are real, then people turn to asking, which of their neighbours or which of their family members might have caused this particular misfortune. So it's actually a phenomenon that is prevalent across many parts of the world. Together with some colleagues, we did a study looking just at reports on the internet and found there were reports across 60 different countries. So it's certainly a phenomenon that is widespread, and it doesn't seem to be one that is going away either. In the country that I have spent the most time working, in Papua New Guinea, we see regular cases where people are accused. Sometimes this just leads to them being stigmatised or forced away from their community, but sometimes it leads to actual cases of physical violence and even, unfortunately, torture and death.
What other countries are we seeing? You said 60, that's a lot. Is it concentrated in certain regions or is it kind of pretty widespread?
There's a lot of cases in India and in Nepal, and in those countries then it's mostly targeted towards women. Whereas in other countries, in parts of Africa, then there's quite a wide variety of victim classes. In some countries, it's particularly children who are targeted. So, for example, it might be that a stepmother will come into a family, and so the child of the previous family is no longer particularly wanted, and so there'll be an accusation of witchcraft that will be made against that child. In some cases as well, there are children who exhibit tendencies such as bedwetting, or they're just particularly disobedient, and so they might be taken to a healer, and that healer might say, well, there's evil spirits involved, and so that will lead to the accusation coming. We also, however, find these cases in parts of the global north. So it really depends on which countries have started counting. So, for example, in the United Kingdom, there were a few cases that involved the police finding the corpses of children, unfortunately, who had clearly been the victim of some kind of a violent exorcism. And so that led them to really focus on this phenomenon and to start counting the cases as a way of trying to do prevention, to educate the social services people about how to look out for these kind of cases. And so since they started counting in 2012, they've been identifying many, many cases. Last year, they identified 2,000 cases, which is actually more than the cases that they've been identifying for female genital mutilation, for example. And I've got colleagues in the United States who have just started counting the cases there as well. And again, they've started to find many cases, often involving children.
A huge part of the persecution of witches in the early modern period, so Salem and in Europe as well, it wasn't just the courts or the law, but it was actually the community around these people who were being persecuted. They were the ones getting swept up in the hysteria, and the law and the courts seemed to just respond to the community hysteria. How different are the modern instances of persecuting witchcraft that we're seeing? Is it the same sort of deal or is it much more secret?
It's a lot more secret, and you're very right that these days, in fact, in most countries, the state is opposed to witch hunts and to witchcraft accusations, and many countries are trying to introduce new laws as well to address this problem. So it's not something that is sanctioned by the state. It's something that is a form of collective violence that a community will engage in. But because often so many people are complicit in that violence, then there isn't a reporting to the state, or if there is a reporting, then it's very difficult to get witnesses. And so we find that there is a lot of impunity for these kind of cases. Again, where I've been working in Papua New Guinea, I found that there have been a handful of cases that have been prosecuted each year, but that is just a drop in the water compared to the number of cases that are actually going ahead. One of the other things that I found interesting in Papua New Guinea is that although on average about 50% of the people being accused are men and 50% are women, when we look at what successful prosecutions there've been, then we find that about 85% of those cases involve male victims. So it shows that men are finding it much easier to get access to justice for these kinds of abuses than women are.
It's so sad. And the way you describe it as well, it's it seems rooted in the same ideas of the past witch trials that we've seen, which I think to most people in Western societies go, oh, that was so far in the past and no one would ever do that anymore. But it seems like the similar sort of ideas around it are persisting in certain communities. And look, the UN has been looking at modern day witch persecution. What is it found out and what is it recommended?
Many of the different reporting regimes of reporting of human rights abuses of the UN have reported from time to time on the problem of witchcraft accusations and violence. So, for example, the Special Rapporteur on arbitrary torture and so forth have reported on this. So it's not a new phenomenon for the UN to take notice of. However, in 2021, the UN for the first time published a resolution that was specifically addressed to harmful practices related to accusations of witchcraft and ritual attacks. So it was the first time that the UN really identified this as a particular form of human rights abuse that really all of the states across the world need to do something about. That was then followed by a special expert report in 2023 that identified that this is widespread across the world, that it impacts in particular upon women and the elderly, those who suffer from other forms of disability, children as well, and again called upon states and also INGOs, civil society, everyone really to do a part to try to address this problem. Because it's not just the person who is accused who is impacted. Often the person who's accused, their children will also be treated with suspicion. And sometimes it can lead to whole communities fragmenting and huge amounts of dislocation.
Is there a lot of work going into trying to stop this? I mean, I know you said that it's not sanctioned by the states. They're not, as in countries, they're not saying, yep, we support this. They're actively against it. However, the problem persists. Are there task groups? Are there people going into these communities to try and provide education? Or is nothing really being done in this space on the ground to try and stop it?
I think it's accurate to say that there are ad hoc initiatives across the world to try to address it, but there has certainly been nothing like the amount of resources and support put into this. It's only really a form of human rights abuse that is starting to be acknowledged by national governments and by the UN as well as something that really deserves significant attention. So what we find is that it's generally individuals who are affected in one way or another by the issue in their particular country who are going out of their way to try to do education, to try to look after the survivors. And, these people all of them deserve medals. It's extraordinary the danger that they put themselves into and the dedication that they show to try to address this problem, to set up safe houses, to educate their community, to try to do broader awareness. There are some governments who are doing some excellent work. So, for example, in Papua New Guinea, there is a national action plan around sorcery accusation-related violence that has been developed, and that adopts the approach that it really needs to be a holistic solution. So we need to think about educating our health workers so that they can explain the causes of death and sickness in a way that don't trigger sorcery accusations. That we need to think about educating children not to just accept these kind of narratives so that they can employ critical thinking. That we also need to make sure that our justice system operates correctly so that there are not these problems of impunity. But a lot of countries as well are not sufficiently taking steps or putting the necessary resources into addressing the problem.
I think a lot of people would be horrified to hear what's going on in some countries. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us today and explain to us, the phenomenon of modern day witch trials.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for putting the necessary focus on this issue.
Thanks for listening to today's briefing. That's all for this episode. A reminder, we do put out full eps of our weekend briefing chats on YouTube. You can search Listener Newsroom to see them, and you can catch up with our other video content on TikTok at Listener Newsroom and on Instagram, which is at The Briefing Podcast. And if you liked this ep, why not share it with someone you think might enjoy it too? I'm Sasha Barbagat. See you next time.
listener.